Chapter 8. A Year of Testing. Seth, quote-unquote, looks into envelopes and gives Rob a few art lessons. For the next 11 months, the Seth sessions dealt mainly with test data of one kind or another. At 9 p.m., as usual, Seth would begin with the theoretical material in which we were increasingly interested. At 10 p.m., he gave impressions for Dr. Instream, and after that, Rob gave me an envelope if there was to be such a test that evening. If we did have one of our own tests, then we'd sit up after the session trying to evaluate the results. By then, it was usually past midnight, and we would be exhausted. Although my confidence had risen with the 2 out-of-body episodes, I felt that I was putting Seth and myself on the line with each test session. I never knew whether or not we would have an envelope test. Often I was afraid of having a session for fear we'd have an envelope test and the results just would not apply. This never happened incidentally, though the impressions given were not always as specific as we would have liked. Actually, I didn't care what was in the envelopes. I just wanted to know if Seth could tell us, and I wanted him to be absolutely right each time. My attitude was bound to have an effect. Now I wonder that Seth was able to do anything with me at all in those days, but most of the time he managed to do very well indeed. Here's an instance where Rob was trying to test for clairvoyance rather than telepathy. Like many others, this test had surprising results. Rob's notes show clearly the procedure he followed in choosing the test item. In my studio was a pile of old newspapers. Most of them were of the New York Times, both daily and Sunday copies. Shortly before the session, I removed a few local papers from the stack. Then, backing up to the pile, I pulled out a section without looking at it and tore off a portion of a page. I folded this behind me until I was sure it would fit between the regular double Bristol and into the double envelopes. Still, without looking at the paper I'd chosen as object, I sealed it in the envelopes. Then, with my eyes closed, I picked up the section from which the object had been taken, groped over to a floor-to-ceiling bookcase, and placed it on a high shelf where I would not see it. This procedure left me knowing only one thing about the object, that it was from some section of the New York Times, date unknown. After the experiment was over, Jane opened the envelopes containing the test object. Then I went back to the studio, and from the hidden section, I picked out the page from which the object had been torn. It turned out to be pages 11 to 12 of Section 1 of the Times for Sunday, November 6, 1966. Seth gave 39 impressions. Almost all of them had direct application. Here are several pertaining to the test object, grouped together for convenience. A paper item, rougher rather than smooth background. The object was a piece of newspaper, coarse newspaper rather than, say, a coded magazine paper stock. A gray view. Portions of illustrations were visible on both sides of the item, all in gray tones. Liberal giving. The words liberal discounts appear on the object. Connection with a telephone or telephone call. On one side of the item, we find no mail or phone orders, and on the other side, mail and phone orders filled, plus a long series of telephone exchange numbers. Something identical to something else, two or two of a kind. The word twin appears on the object, referring to the size of a blanket on sale. I had the strong subjective impression, however, that this was a reference to the fact that the envelope object was a part of a similar object. The above impressions referred to the test object itself. Now here are some about the page from which the object was taken. Seth said, in consecutive order, a method of disposal, something in the vernacular, gubernatorial, I was after the word gubernatorial, but here, as usual, Rob recorded it the way I pronounced it in trance. For a minute, this data stumped us when we went over the test results. Then Rob looked at the full newspaper page. Both of us caught on at once. "Wow," I said, "a method of disposal. That must be sales. But what a crazy way to put it." "And look at this," Rob said, holding up the item in one hand and the full page in the other. "Election Day sales, or values," is printed in black headlines at the top of both sides of the page. And gubernatorial, or gubernatorial, applies because the election for New York State Governor was on November 9th. I'd also say that the phrase Election Day sales is certainly in the vernacular. Refer to the illustrated section for reproductions of the test item and the page from which it was torn. Both sides of the test item contained portions of advertisements that were tied in with Election Day, yet the words Election Day didn't appear on the object itself at all, only on the whole newspaper page that had lain on a high shelf of Rob's studio bookcase. "But why didn't Seth just say sales?" I asked in exasperation. "Listen," Rob said, laughing. "We have to go along with the way that data comes through and try to learn from it. You did well." Now, I think that this is an excellent example of the way extrasensory perceptions are sometimes received. Sales are a method of disposal, yet verbally, the final connection isn't as concise as we would like. There's more than just the idea of conciseness involved, though. Such answers are often just different, unexpectedly so, and they make us consider old objects or ideas in new and equally valid ways. I'll have more to say about this sort of thing later in this chapter. There were quite a few other surprises in this test. Not only did Seth pick up this excellent identifying information, but he gave further impressions concerning the whole page from which the test item had been taken. Besides all the sales, there were 4 articles on the large section. The envelope item didn't include these, yet Seth gave impressions referring to 3 of them. A mission with unforeseen consequences. 1943. Ilya, and perhaps an F and R. Something happening all over again, as a commemoration. A connection with something green, as a meadow, a child, Januarius. All of this referred to an article dealing with a Dominican seminary founded in Aldeia Nova, Portugal in 1943. We believe Ilya an attempt to get at Aldeia. The given date was correct, and the article goes on to tell about a young priest, Father Fernandez, F and R, the abbreviation for father is FR, who was on a mission in this country to get funds to modernize the seminary. He was also described as organizing a pilgrimage to commemorate the 50th anniversary celebrations at Fatima, which is only 10 miles from the seminary. The article states that the seminary includes, among other things, its own farm, vineyards, and vegetable and fruit gardens. We think that the green as meadow impression referred to these. The Januarius connection doesn't seem to be related, yet it is highly important because, for me personally, it had a strong religious connotation. One of my favorite grade school teachers was a nun, Sister Januarius. The article speaks of the 3 children who saw the apparition at Fatima, and Seth mentioned a child. Other impressions dealt with another article headlined, "Portugal Shows Dip in Prisoners." This specifically referred to the need to modernize the big, old, antiquated prisons that were of very low standard, and made several remarks concerning the crime rate in Portugal. The article also stated that Portugal has the lowest per capita income in Europe. Seth's impressions were fairly obvious here. Connection with a monstrosity, as of a monstrous building, a disturbance, a determination and a disadvantage, and inadequate performance. Seth also gave some impressions of the page from which the envelope item was taken, besides those dealing with the articles. A date above, buttons, some figures and a distant connection with skull shapes, the colors blue and purple and green, and other round shapes. The date of the paper was at the top of the page, of course. Buttons, many of them, are clearly shown in the photographs of clothing for sale. These same models are also the figures Seth mentions, and as you can see from the photograph of the page, the women's faces give a skull-like impression, with their hair pulled back. The colors mentioned by Seth are listed in the sheet advertisement. Purple, I believe, refers to quote-unquote orchid mist. This test brought several questions to mind at once, though. How had Seth picked up the information about the entire page when only a small section of it was in the test envelope? Had some kind of projection on my part been involved, back to the studio bookcase? Seth hadn't first given impressions of the envelope object itself, then neatly moved on to deal with the entire page. He shifted back and forth between the two, as if viewing both at once. And why had he not confined his data just to the envelope object? We asked Seth about these points in a later session, and got some very interesting answers. A portion is always connected to the whole of which it is a part, he said. From the torn section, then, to me, the whole page was present, and from portions of the whole can be read. With enough freedom on the one hand, and training on the other, Rupert, speaking for me, could give you the entire copy of the New York Times from a torn corner. This does not involve projection. There were other issues having to do with Rupert's own characteristics. Now, it is true, generally speaking, that material of an emotional nature actually has a stronger vitality and is easier to perceive. Beyond this, however, Rupert has no love for detail, Seth smiled, and will always use it as a clue to see where it leads him. He would not be content simply to give the details on the snatch of paper. This is a fairly automatic tendency of his mental life. We use it, I hope, to advantage in our sessions in other ways. In the tests, however, we tried to utilize this characteristic, since we could not deny it. Rupert's abilities are what I have to work with, and through, besides, of course, my own. So we used this tendency here to enlarge the picture and bring in further details that gave you rather respectable data, and in a way that was fairly natural to Rupert. About the tests in general, Seth said, I was teaching him, and I went along with his natural interests and inclinations. The antagonism he has for testing came not from the idea itself, as much as from the idea of focusing upon detail for detail's sake. Often, when you had that kind of a test, did he become antagonistic. In extrasensory perception, as in so-called normal perception, the natural inclinations of the personality dictate the kind of information that will be sought from any available field of data. There are many areas of knowledge in which any given individual is uninterested. He will not bother to use even normal perception to obtain it. I give Rupert access to large fields of focus. I help him change the energy that he uses in perception into other directions, to turn it inward. I make information available to him. Then, according to his basic characteristics, he uses the information. The test just described stressed clairvoyance. An earlier test was extremely illuminating from a different standpoint, convincing us that the original extrasensory perception is general, like an overall field of a large area. Somewhere, a narrowing down process